Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be doing our fourth set of imperialism notes. We are going to be talking about how the Spanish-American War actually affected Latin America, particularly Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And we're also going to be discussing Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy. So your warm-up for today was who was the Filipino rebel that used the guerrilla tactics against the United States in the Philippine-American War. That was from your last set of notes. Hopefully you remembered it was Emilio Aguinaldo. All right, so these are the standards we're working with today. These are Tennessee U.S. history standards. You need to know the Teller, Platt, and Foraker Acts. You need to know what the Roosevelt Corollary is. You need to be able to describe and compare and contrast Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy and William Taft's dollar diplomacy. All right, so you also need to be able to talk about what the consequences of the Spanish-American War on Latin America were. Okay. All right, so let's get started. Let's jump right in. The big question that the Congress is faced with, excuse me, I cannot talk tonight, is what do we do with all these people we just took over? Right? Spanish-American War is over. We are now an empirical country. We have an empire. We've got all these territories and all these different countries that we are in charge of. So what do we do with them? Specifically, how are the people who live in those countries treated? Okay, so it becomes a constitutional question. The question is, do those native people in those U.S. possessions automatically become U.S. citizens? Okay, because technically, if you're going by the 14th Amendment says that anyone who was born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen. So those natives were born on that soil and it's now U.S. soil. So are they citizens? And if they're not, what about all of their children who were born after it becomes a territory? Once it becomes U.S. soil, excuse me, that's my train of thought. Once it becomes a U.S. territory, once there's U.S. soil, does anyone born on that soil automatically become U.S. citizens? That's the big question. And it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court in a series of cases that we all lump together in U.S. history class, and we call them the insular cases. It goes to the Supreme Court in 1901, and the Supreme Court says, no, they do not automatically become citizens. They said citizenship does not automatically follow the flag. Just because America owns it or controls it does not necessarily mean that those people get to be American citizens. And the Supreme Court actually lays out the rules for how to become citizens. And they said Congress is the only one that can do that. Congress is the only one who can grant, extend, or give citizenship to people. An example of this would be Puerto Rico. Okay, Puerto Rico in 1900 was given self-government by the Foraker Act. This means that the American military left Puerto Rico and allowed Puerto Rico to run itself. Kind of, we'll get to that. 1917, Puerto Rico in the Jones Act is given U.S. citizenship. So they become U.S. citizens. And they are still U.S. citizens. If you were born in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen. You just don't have the right to vote because you don't pay taxes. All right, so the question now, we're going to do this little territory by territory. How did the U.S. deal with Guam after the Spanish-American War? This is the easy one. We're going to get it out of the way. Remember, Guam was that teeny tiny little island we got over near the Philippines from the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so the territory of Guam. Guam is going to become an official territory of the United States. It still is. And we love it because it's a very strategic naval base. So if you look at this, Guam is really, really close to the Philippines. It's really, really close to Japan. It's close to Midway. Hawaii's over here. So it's a nice place to have a military base. Okay. And remember, we needed this because the Philippines were still rebelling against us. So we're still fighting a war right there. So it's nice to have a military base close. It's very strategic. We love it. They love having us there. That's how they like it. Okay, it's still a United States territory. That's how the people of Guam like it. Now, they do have self-government there today. They do kind of get to run themselves. They don't get right to vote or anything in America. They're not American citizens or anything. But they do get the benefit of having an American military base there. Guam is a teeny tiny little island surrounded by big countries. And the fact that it's a U.S. territory kind of gives it some protection. Okay. So how did the U.S. deal with Puerto Rico? Okay, this one's where it's going to get a little bit funny. Okay. We did rule Puerto Rico for a while. Right after the Spanish-American War, after the Treaty of Paris gives us Puerto Rico, we send in the military to say, you're ours now. We're taking it. Okay. And it will be ruled by the military under General Nelson A. Miles. And Puerto Rico is kind of, they're up on the edge. How are you going to deal with this? Are we going to be a territory? Are we going to be a state? Are we going to be just some kind of weird protectorate you take care of, but you don't deal with? How is this going to go? And they actually asked Congress, and they had to wait back to hear from Congress to know how this was going to happen. What you've got here, I absolutely love this cartoon. See if I can point it out. Here you go. This is President McKinley, who was the president during the Spanish-American War. Okay, he's a waiter. Okay, and there's Uncle Sam. Remember, Uncle Sam always represents. Hopefully, you guys at least thought in your head, American government, right? And then bill of fare. That's a menu. You've got the Cuba steak, the Puerto Rico pig, Philippine Islands, right? Sandwich Islands, which are the other ones in the Caribbean, Midway, and some in the Pacific. I like that they call it Puerto Rico pig. You're going to see in a second, Puerto Rico actually does kind of look like a pig. And then it says, well, I hardly know which to take first. All right, so return to a civilian government. Now, the military has to leave Puerto Rico eventually. We can't just be there forever. And a lot of natives, they want one of two things. They don't want to be in that weird kind of territory stage for too long. A lot of the native Puerto Ricans were looking for either statehood, become a U.S. state, or be an independent country of their own. That they didn't want to not be granted the benefits of being a state and still be under the control of the United States. But the U.S. is very reluctant to give up the control of Puerto Rico because it is so strategically located. We're going to talk tomorrow about the need for the Panama Canal. And we had decided by this point that whoever controls the Caribbean Sea is going to end up controlling the Panama Canal. So we don't have Cuba. We promised we wouldn't take over Cuba, so we can't have Cuba. So we have to have an island here in kind of the gateway area into the Caribbean Sea to have a military base. And Puerto Rico is really, really good for us. It's a good place to have it. And we don't want to give that up. All right, as far as Puerto Rico is concerned, 1900, we talked about this a second ago, the Foraker Act established a civilian government. So this is the actual act that is pulling the military out of the island, out of Puerto Rico. Now, the Foraker Act says that the president gets to pick the governor of Puerto Rico. And the president also gets to pick part of the legislature of Puerto Rico. And then the Puerto Ricans themselves will vote to fill the remainder of the seats. Foraker Act does say specifically that Puerto Ricans are not considered U.S. citizens yet. Citizenship happens again in 1917 with the Jones-Shafroth Act. I usually just call it the Jones Act. And it's not until 1952 that Puerto Rico is granted Commonwealth status. Now, Commonwealth, it doesn't really mean anything. There's 4 states that have Commonwealth as part of their name. It's the Commonwealth of Kentucky, it's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and there's 2 others I can't think off the top of my head. So Commonwealth doesn't actually mean anything unless you're referring to a territory. According to the U.S. government, a Commonwealth that is a territory of the United States is basically guaranteed a government. it's guaranteed that the United States will not go in and just withdraw all of the government of that country and take over again. So there's steps the United States has to have before they can interfere in Puerto Rico's government. All right, so now let's get to Cuba. This is going to get to be some of the fun stuff. Okay. Cuba was militarily occupied for 4 years after this war. It was occupied until 1902. And what's interesting is a lot of the same officials who served Spain remained in office serving us. Now, these are Cubans. They are not Spanish officials. Okay. A lot of the Cubans who were put in place to run things for Spain are still in place running things for us. And anyone who's protesting that is going to be either imprisoned or kicked off the island. Now, while we're there, the U.S. military does do good, right? We're there for 4 years. We're not just going to sit there and do nothing. So we help provide food and clothing for the poor people on the island. We help farmers because, remember, Cuba, we want them to like us. They're a sugar island, and sugar is expensive. So if we can get on good terms with Cuba and help the farmers out, maybe they'll cut us a deal whenever they're selling us the sugar. We also give medical help. We end up eliminating yellow fever while we're there, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And we also set up an organization for schools. And remember, schools are always a really great way to Americanize people. They're a great way to kind of brainwash kids into thinking what you want them to. You are what you repeatedly do and hear. So if you've got kids that are taught to speak English and you've got kids that are taught that democracy is the right way to go, it's hard for them to change those opinions as they get older. All right, yellow fever. Dr. Carlos Finley, a Cuban doctor actually, proposed this thing called the mosquito hypothesis in 1881. And he said, everyone I've seen who has caught yellow fever has mosquito bites. So maybe it's the mosquitoes that are transferring this. The problem is he couldn't prove it. Now it is a U.S. Army doctor, Dr. Walter Reed, who proved this hypothesis. He was in Cuba already. And remember, more American soldiers died of yellow fever than they did of actual wounds during battle. So he had a lot of yellow fever cases, and he started studying this. And he does manage to prove the link between mosquitoes and yellow fever. Today, we know that the main culprit here is this Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti, which is the tiger mosquito. It's also sometimes called the yellow fever mosquito. This is the mosquito that will transfer the yellow fever. Okay. It looks super creepy. I don't know about y'all, but I think it looks super creepy. Okay. Now we're going to talk about how Cuba became fully independent. And I'm using the word fully here because we don't actually give them independence. Okay. If you remember, before we got involved in this war, back in 1898, we were worried, anti-imperialists like Mark Twain, some other writers, the Anti-Imperialist League, they were worried that America would use this Spanish-American War as an excuse to annex Cuba. So we passed that Teller Resolution, which was a promise we wouldn't take it over. Our whole goal was to make Cuba independent. That was our promise. So we can't go back on that. We can't just take Cuba, even though we really, really want to. So Congress does the next best thing. Congress passes the Platt Amendment to bind Cuba to the United States. Now, think about this. Our Congress, the United States Congress, passes an amendment and then forces Cuba to adopt it. That would be like us passing a law and then forcing Canada to use it. And that's what we did. And our leverage was we were still there militarily to keep the Spanish from coming back and taking the Cuba back over. So our response was, well, you can accept this Platt Amendment and do what it says, or we can leave and Spain can come back and take y'all over. So they are going to adopt the Platt Amendment. And what the Platt Amendment says is the whole job is to make Cuba dependent on America. So it gives the United States control of Cuba's foreign policy, which means before Cuba can negotiate a treaty with another country, America has to approve it. Before Cuba can borrow money from any other country, America has to approve it. The Platt Amendment said that the United States had to be given a permanent naval base in Cuba. That permanent naval base is Guantanamo Bay. We still have that. Cuba doesn't want us to have it, but we still have it. And then the third part of the Platt Amendment is that the U.S. reserves the right to intervene in Cuba's government whenever we see the fit. Whenever we feel like Cuba's not doing something we want them to, we are allowed to go into Cuba and tell them to do something. Are you starting to see why Cuba didn't like us? Okay, this is setting the stage for Cuba becoming communist in the 50s and 60s. Okay, this is what sets the stage. This bad blood, Taylor Swift song playing in your head. Okay, this bad blood between Cuba and America is what's going to be one of the reasons why Cuba sides with the Soviet Union and becomes communist. All right, so officially, because of the Platt Amendment, Cuba, while on paper it's independent, it's actually a U.S. protectorate. Now, a protectorate is a country, usually a weak country, whose affairs or government is partially controlled by a stronger power. Like, we don't care about like speed limits in Cuba, right? We're worried about more like big national issues. So that is, Cuba becomes a protectorate of us, and we actually do take that paternalistic role where we start treating Cuba like it's a kid, and we're their parent, and we're telling them, what's good for them. All right, so now we have Roosevelt's big stick policy. This is the last thing we're going to talk about today. And the big stick policy goes back to this old African proverb that Teddy Roosevelt said came from West Africa. You remember Roosevelt was a big game hunter. He liked to go on safari in Africa a lot. And he said one of his guides told him this proverb whenever he was talking about, how do you keep lions from jumping out and attacking you? And he said the old African proverb was, walk softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. Now, this is an old African proverb, and the thought process here is, if you're quiet and you don't draw attention to yourself, the lions won't come to you. And if you have a big stick, if you have a big enough weapon to beat off the lions if they do show up, then you'll be fine, right? You'll be able to get where you're going. So before we can get to Roosevelt and his foreign policy as president, we have to make him president. So we talked about this during the Progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt actually was vice president under McKinley for McKinley's second term when McKinley got elected in 1900. But remember, he's elected in 1900, and 1900 ends in 0, which means it's a curse year. So McKinley's going to die while he's in office, and he's actually only in office for, a couple months, not even a whole year. September 6th, 1901, this guy, Leon Slousgoz, I can't do that last name. It's a phlegmy thing. I can't do it. He's an anarchist. He shot President McKinley. It takes McKinley a while to die. He dies, a little over a week later. And, he dies very, very late that night. And then very early the next morning, Teddy Roosevelt gets sworn in as president. Those of you who are into British history, it's one of those, the king is dead, long live the king things. The second the president dies, the vice president becomes president. Now, remember, Roosevelt was put in the vice presidency because the people in charge of the Republican Party didn't know what to do with him, right? So they figured, let's make him vice president and we'll keep him in a powerless position for 4 years while we figure this out. And that's obviously didn't work for them. He's going to be in a very powerful position. Now, he still holds the record as the youngest president ever inaugurated. Now, inaugurated actually means to start or to begin. We use it to mean that swearing in ceremony where they put their hand on their Bible. Well, other way, when they put their left hand on the Bible and they raise their right hand and they swear to uphold the laws of the Constitution and protect the country. He's the youngest president to ever do that. Okay. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's view of foreign policy. Remember, foreign policy is how he wants to treat other countries. We've already talked about his domestic policy. Domestic policy, how he wants to treat America, that was the square deal. Okay. So now we're talking about foreign policy. Now, the Secretary of State here is the same Secretary of State that McKinley had. This is John Hay. This is the guy that called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war because we had lost relatively little life and gained a huge empire from it. Okay, so he is very much, John Hay is very much an imperialist. So whenever he's telling the president, when he's advising the president, he's not going to be advising the president to not take things over. Okay, now the U.S. foreign policy, according to Roosevelt, should be based only on what was in the best interest of the United States. So it shouldn't matter what Britain wants us to do. It shouldn't matter what France wants us to do. It shouldn't matter how we will look to other countries. The only thing that should matter is this a good thing for the United States? And if it is a good thing for the United States, then we should do it. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that the U.S. Navy should be used as a way to enforce our will and protect our interests. So he believes, right, that we should be able to go out and do whatever we think is best for us. And we're going to use that Navy, which is that Great White Fleet. Remember, we have the world's most modern Navy now. We're going to use that to kind of go and take what we want and then to protect things that we take. Okay. It goes back to that proverb. Okay. Speak softly and carry a big stick. He's not going to go out and overtly thumb his nose at Britain and France, right? He's not going to go out and purposely make enemies. So he's going to speak softly there, right? He's not going to try to antagonize anybody. But he's going to do what he thinks is best for us. And if people get mad at us and they come at us for that, his big stick that he uses to fight them off is the U.S. Navy, is that Great White Fleet. Okay. Now, the big stick diplomacy, okay, this whole foreign policy of his, it goes by two different names. One is the big stick policy because he was constantly referring to that African proverb. And then the second one is also known as gunboat diplomacy, because we're using the gunboats to affect our diplomacy, right? The way we're reacting with other countries is all through the Navy. Okay. As a matter of fact, he actually took the Great White Fleet, that modern Navy, and had it go out on a tour through the Pacific to kind of intimidate China and Japan. Now, Roosevelt, he believes in a need for a balance of power in Latin America. And when he says balance of power, he doesn't mean all the Latin American countries being equal. He means America being here, and then all of the Latin American countries being here, and the European countries being over there somewhere not involved. Okay, so that was his balance of power. So he thinks the United States should be responsible for protecting those smaller Latin American countries that the European countries are trying to take over, and those countries that he considers less civilized. And by less civilized, he means not like America. So the ones that weren't democracies, the ones that weren't trying to be democracies, the ones that were still technically colonies of Europe. He is wanting to go in and protect those smaller countries from the big, bad, mean European countries that are trying to control them. All right, so beginning of these notes, the very first set of notes we did was the Monroe Doctrine. Whenever we talked about the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine said that basically European countries couldn't come into the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, and take over colonies anymore. We weren't going to allow that to happen. Well, by the early 1900s, the European countries had found a loophole. They didn't actually have to take over a country and make it a colony to control it. Remember, we talked, there's different types of imperialism. So instead of being a colony, they could make it economically dependent on them. So what they would do was they would make a run at these weaker Latin American countries by lending them lots of money and then threatening to call those loans in. So either you do what I tell you, or I'm going to call in my loan and your country's going to go bankrupt. So Roosevelt does not like this. But the problem is they're not technically violating the Monroe Doctrine, right? They're not making them colonies. So Roosevelt doesn't have any legal leg to stand on. He can't go and tell them, you have to stop whenever we never told them they couldn't do that. So Roosevelt changes the Monroe Doctrine. He adds something he calls the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary says that European countries have to stay out of North and South America, period. They can't be involved economically. They can't be involved socially. They can't be involved politically. None of it. They have to get out. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary stated that the U.S. would act as a police force in the case of chronic wrongdoing. Now, basically, the chronic wrongdoing here is the European countries trying to have influence in Latin America. Give you some specifics here. He specifically said that any problem with any country in the Western Hemisphere had to be given to the United States for mediation. You got a problem in the Western Hemisphere and you're not in the Western Hemisphere, it's got to come through me. It's got to come through the United States. So if Britain or France or England or Russia has a problem with any country in the Western Hemisphere, we're in charge of the Western Hemisphere. So you don't go to them, you come to us, and we will figure it out. The second thing he says is that whatever we decide goes. There is no place to go and appeal. Okay. And if you decide you don't like our decision and we're not your country, so you don't have to listen to us, we're going to consider that an act of war. So if Britain is trying to call in a loan on Brazil, right, to make Brazil do something, Brazil can appeal to us, and Britain and Brazil would have to go to America and talk this out. And America would decide how this would go. They'd probably set up a payment plan for Brazil to follow that wouldn't make Brazil go bankrupt. And if England says, no, we're not going to follow that, you're going to pay us back or we're going to show up and take the money, they're talking to Brazil, but according to the Roosevelt Corollary, refusing to accept our decision is the same thing as declaring war against us. So then out comes the big stick, right? Out comes the U.S. Navy to back up our decisions. He said any attempt to go around the United States, if you're trying to call in a loan on another country and you're trying to make it to where you don't come through us to fix this problem, that's foreign vigilantism. Okay. You guys have heard of vigilantes? A vigilante is someone who takes the law into their own hands, illegally. Roosevelt says you can't do that. If you try to go around us and you try to deal with your problem without coming through us, it's the same thing as you being a vigilante. You can't do that. All right. Now, Latin America mostly does not like the big stick policy. Once again, it's very paternalistic, right? It's very, they're children. They can't take care of themselves. We're going to step in and be the parent here. We're going to step in and lead the way. And they really don't like that. They don't like being treated like they're kids, like they can't take care of themselves. Now, a lot of people in America, those anti-imperialists, they thought that these U.S. policies threatened sovereignty and liberty, right? We are America. We are the land of the free and the home of the brave. We very much believe that a government has to be accountable to its citizens, right? We believe that our votes matter. And by going in and basically controlling these countries, we're saying that the people of those countries have no say in how their country is run. And for anti-imperialists, that is not that's not what America stands for. So that's a big issue they have there. Okay, so you should remember from the progressive era, Roosevelt promised he wouldn't run for a second term because he's already served 7 years and he doesn't want to go over the 8. So he handpicks Taft, and Taft is going to become president. Now remember, Taft, he was a weaker president than Roosevelt. He didn't know how to do all the political maneuvering that Roosevelt knew how to do, and he also believed more strongly in following the letter of the law. So he's not going to do big stick diplomacy. Taft just doesn't believe that's how do I say this? He doesn't think the Constitution gives the president the right to do that. So Taft, he wants to reduce the military presence in Latin America. He wants to reduce the naval presence specifically in Latin America. So Taft replaces the big stick policy or gunboat diplomacy. He replaces that with what he called dollar diplomacy. And he would swap basically bullets for dollars. So instead of using our military to go in and influence Latin America, we would invest in Latin America. We would, lend Latin America money. We would buy goods from Latin America that would help build up those weaker countries. Now, ironically enough, this is basically the same thing that Roosevelt just told the European countries they weren't allowed to do in Latin America. That controlling the countries through the economy. But that's exactly what Taft is going to do. Now, occasionally, Taft still has to bring out the Navy. He still has to bring out that big stick to protect our interests because people are always testing you, especially whenever you're a new country like us and you're new to becoming imperialist and you're new to having territories. People are constantly going to be testing you to see where your weak spots are. All right, and that is it, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good day.